guys are good. Let me ask you, before I get into the sermon in full here, to help me here. Would you raise your hand if you belong to a book group? Yeah, there's a lot of folks around here. I've been impressed in my time in the Copper Country by how many people are really ardently engaged in book groups. And I've talked to folks in this congregation who are members, and one told me that, well, there's just so much snow in the winter, we are determined to get together with others and just talk. Another person shared that they have a tradition of driving from Houghton to Pelkey for their monthly book group meeting because of a long-term commitment that they hold for the people in the group. And as I talked to her, I got the sense that the relationship was almost like family. Whatever the reason, there is a sense of association, of being in relationship, represented by the vibrancy of this book group culture. I think that associational sense has infused itself in the hearts of many in this congregation. It makes coming together in what we're going to talk about today, small group ministries, seamless for many of you. And as the new guy, I recognize a sort of organic drive in you all to get together, to come together. And I want to let you know I really appreciate it. Small group ministry began in an organized way in UU congregations in 1997, when Reverend Glenn Turner, a district executive in the UUA, began studying the teachings of a Christian evangelist named Carl George. George was at that time advocating what he called the meta church, as opposed to the mega church approach for growing congregations. He was using covenant groups to nurture members and welcome new people as what he thought was the best way to grow a healthy congregation. George's concept decentralized ministry within his congregation, and that decentralization met some resistance as it spread, as the small group ministry idea spread to additional congregations. Clergy in those other congregations may have treated their work more as magistry than ministry, and they hesitated to incorporate the small group ministry model. The clergy were more comfortable defining authoritatively the boundaries of that which is appropriate than they were in exploring those boundaries with their congregations. Reverend Turner wasn't hesitant about the new small group ministry idea, and along with Reverend Calvin Dam from Maine, a UU community church in Maine, they adapted the strategy for UU congregations. And shortly after, the two ministers presented their ideas at the UUA's Southwestern Conference, and they were met with a positive response to their UU small group ministry idea. I think it's an obligation for me to also state that it would be historically accurate to note that these early UU proponents thought that small group process would kind of help solve a problem that was chronic in UU congregations. Reverend Turner and others hoped that many UU congregations could become more hospitable and less contentious, with the emphasis on community rather than on debate. So you see, not every congregation shares the Copper Country's book group fervor. Small group ministry gained popularity across the UUA, and by the mid-2000s, it was estimated that 50% of congregations had established small group ministries, or again, covenant groups. The groups typically had 6 to 10 people, and they would start with forming their own covenant. That's an agreement about how they would operate and how group members would conduct themselves. The covenant groups were recognized as helping church members and newcomers get acquainted, deepening the relationships between one another in the congregation and with the broader church, and providing an opportunity for spiritual reflection. I think many of you will remember KUUF's listening circles from a few years back. I think they would have fallen into the small group ministry model, and I think they actually followed the UUA's model pretty closely. Recently, our fellowship has generated 3 small group ministries, a men's and a women's group, and a gratitude gathering. None of these groups are following too strictly to the UU model. I see them as part of our organic movement toward association. And nobody, namely me, has yet given the moniker of small group ministry to these 3 new occurrences. And so I worried that you might not have known that that's what we're doing. But we are doing small group ministry. We are reaching out to one another and intending to share ourselves with each other. In this way, we are exploring and living more fully into our faith. Recently, the UUA revised and published the Unitarian Universalist Pocket Guide. It's just this small little book that is a brief introduction to our faith community, something that you'd kind of hand out to new members kind of thing, you know. And in that book, there's a series of essays. And the first essay was written by the Reverend Rosemary Bray McNatt, who is the president of the Star King School for Ministry in Berkeley, California, which is one of 2 UU seminaries in the United States. And her essay is entitled Our Faith, simply Our Faith. And she writes that rather than a common theology, we are bound by our common history, our affirmation of each person's spiritual quest, and the promises we make to one another about the spiritual values we uphold. Whether you revere God, goddess, nature, the human spirit, or something holy for which you have no name, you are welcome to join any Unitarian Universalist community and to worship, study, work, and be in relationship with people who are all on their own spiritual paths. If you find over time that your personal credo no longer feels adequate to what you see and experience in the world, your Unitarian Universalist community will companion you through those changes. Your doubts and questions will never jeopardize your belonging. In this faith, we welcome doubts and questions, and we uphold one another amid the storms of life. I believe each of our recently launched ministries are nascent platforms from which we can uphold one another amid the storms of life, and I would add, share the joys that are part of our lives as well. I've always liked this quote from a 2006 UU World article written on small group ministries. It's delivered by a new member at a small UU congregation in Texas. So soon after moving from Mississippi to Texas, Meredith Ball joined what was a small congregation called Spindletop UU Church, about 50 members. She found it to be a welcoming congregation, but once she discovered the New Moon Women's Circle at the church, her experience was, as she said, incredible. She said, "We talk about everything in the world and do projects together. The women are very supportive and they're there for each other. We celebrate birthdays. And I've learned to think about God as a female. It just added another level to my life." I will admit to you that I've always been a little tickled by a sentence that has, "We celebrate birthdays, and I've learned to think of God as a female," in the same, it jumps pretty quickly there, But I do think it reveals the capacity for spiritual reflection that is available within small group ministries. And in an anecdotal way, I think it supports and illuminates why I said earlier that these groups help us explore and live more fully into our faith. I believe the religious and spiritual practices that make up small group ministry, covenanted sharing, decentralized authority, and as Reverend Bray McNatt wrote, a free and independent spiritual quest, I believe incorporating those practices into our lives is essential to practicing religious liberalism. James Luther Adams, a mid-20th century Unitarian Universalist theologian, defined the essential elements of religious liberalism. One of those key elements was that religious liberalism affirms the moral obligation to direct one's effort toward the establishment of a just and loving community. And additionally, Adams tags on there that we must also affirm the necessity of social incarnation. The term social incarnation is key. Adams believed that we are made fully human when we live in right relationship with others. And we must be in right relationship to build a just and loving community. I think Adams, and I'm grateful to him for this, was preparing us to understand that good things don't just happen. People working together make them happen. Our religious institutions, and in today's conversation, that institution is this congregation. Our religious institutions must facilitate the skill building of living in right relationship. We must be supported through our individual quests and able to support those quests in others. But more than that individually, we must come together and collectively look at events of our shared lives and collectively create our response to our future. As I said in the beginning, this congregation has an organic drive toward association. You intuitively know what social incarnation means. Our small group ministries help us form the skills we need to push past passivity, the passivity of waiting for good things to happen, and onto making them happen together. Thank you.